Feminism is generally understood to be a movement to secure equal rights for women. In a historic context, it is viewed positively for its crucial role in fighting centuries-old oppressive practices such as sati and child brides. In the 19th and 20th centuries, feminism managed to achieve tremendous success in bringing an end to discriminatory laws against women in areas ranging from family inheritance to political participation. However, the continued existence of feminism is puzzling for many. Increasingly, it is seen as a movement looking for a cause. Since the law already guarantees equality for women, many suspect that now the feminists are seeking women domination. The ideas of feminism are branded as anti-men ideology, dangerous for social stability. Feminists themselves are often caricatured as unhappy, men-hating women. Attempts to further strengthen laws around rape, dowry, and domestic violence elicit strong condemnation from large sections of the society. Social media is flooded with stories on how such laws are misused by avaricious women to blackmail men and their families. Demands for reservation for women in political and corporate spheres are perceived as unfair to men. And demands for women actors and athletes seeking equal pay are considered aggressive and unreasonable. In this context, we at Argumentative Indians want to question if feminism has outlived its use. Have we reached a stage where the demands of women organizations are now threatening equal rights of men? Has feminism gone too far? To discuss this with us, we have Ms. Priyadarshani Bhattacharya, an officer in the Indian Administrative Service, and one of the founders of Viram, a gender-based independent digital platform that promotes conversations on and healing from subliminal forms of gender-based violence. Ms. Bhattacharya has authored several articles and publications on topics related to gender-based oppression, including honor killings, social exclusion, and malnutrition of women in various parts of India. If I can call you Priyadarshani, welcome to Argumentative Indians.
Please go for it.
We're really pleased to have you with us. And before we kickstart, I'd really love for you to share with our viewers a little bit about the organization that you founded, Viram.
Well, first of all, Yajur, thank you so much for having me on this platform. I've gone through your incredible posts and they're really well prepared, I must say. And a big thank you to somebody who's been a member of Argumentative Indians and who's a member of Viram, Vasupriya. So I owe this to her because she's been wonderful and she's in fact introduced me to you. So to tell you a little bit about Viram, I find your introduction very interesting. It's in fact, it gives a lot of fodder for me. And it would, in fact, propel today's conversation. I even found it amusing because a lot of what you're saying are the kind of paradigms that we're really wanting to engage with. And in fact, far from challenging it, it's first an engagement that we want to initiate in Viram. So feminism is, of course, a study. It's a systematic social science discipline. Viram takes a lot from the feminist tradition, and Viram essentially is a collective. It's a loose body of some of us, youngsters who've come together to talk about, the future of feminism. And we're looking into aspects of symbolic and subliminal gender-based violence. And when we talk about such forms of violence, our attempt is consciously to look at the kind of language that you see around us. Even for that matter, feminism, it's become such a misnomer. It carries with it a huge negative baggage. And in Viram, what we're trying to do is we're trying to reconstruct the feminist language and trying to look at certain forms of abuse as violence. We're trying to look at certain acts, micro acts of aggression, as violence, and things that should not ideally be tolerated in an ideal situation of equality that you talk about. Of course, equality still remains an ideal theoretical sort of a construct. It'll take a while for us to reach there. And before we do that, I think we'll have to engage with what is thwarting equality. What is thwarting this equality of opportunity that you spoke about, and what law guarantees, whether society guarantees it or not, is something to really debate about. So Viram essentially is a collective that is creating a lot of information on these new forms of violence. Pardon the term new, they're not really new. They've existed historically. It's just that we're now reorienting the gaze to acts that have often been normalized at best or trivialized at worst. So we are sort of compelling our people to don that gaze and look at things for what essentially they are. And in doing that, we are following a rigorous methodology also, which takes inspiration from feminism. And that is the methodology of feminist epistemology. So what do we mean by feminist epistemology? When we talk to our people, because the content that is being generated is not really from a textbook. It's not really from Google. It's not really coming up with a definition of what subliminal violence is. It is about engaging with people who have experienced these forms of low intensity chronic violence. And how do they see their situations, so it emerges from their subjectivity. So we're not really trying to superimpose a concept here to our viewers and say that, hey, this is subliminal violence. What we're really trying to do is we're trying to engage with people who have experienced such forms of violence and bring in their stories in a respectful manner with the intent of creating a safe space for dialogue.
Can you share any example of?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Yajur, both Katyayani and I, we have had experiences of our friends, beautiful, independent, confident women who come from liberal backgrounds, who have had the opportunity to avail good education, but we've found them completely manipulated. We've found them to, undergo a lot of psychological, emotional, and social tribulations. We found them broken, we found them hurting, and we found them battered. And this, of course, when I say it's not at the physical, quantifiable realm, but their experiences actually propelled us to think about a movement which talks about the less talked about forms of violence. We came up with the chapter, our first chapter in Viram was Rak, where we were essentially documenting the experiences of pain and suffering that a lot of our folks have gone through. And, it's interesting when we were starting with this organization, there was a lot of unsolicited advice given to us that, why would things related to gender inequality affect you girls? I mean, you've reached a certain position, in brackets, privilege, and why at all need we talk about these forms of violence? And, Yajur, you'd know this best. There's a lot of unsolicited advice given to people, and especially young women. And I found it interesting because I was being branded as a feminist, and that was ideally a label that my senior, advised I should avoid, because that would just make me seem like a disgruntled woman who hasn't got a husband by her side. But feminism is so much more than just that. Feminism is about believing in humanity. It's not only about believing in the equality of the sexes, but it is about recognizing the specificity of the genders. Yes, you wanted to say something.
Let me just being devil's advocate and trying to challenge that a little bit. Like you mentioned pain and suffering, but I would argue pain and suffering are universal. Men experience them as well. But
Absolutely.
Is there a risk that if you decide to perceive things using a gender lens, then everything would seem to fit into a gender into that gender-based oppression.
Absolutely,
Where,
that's a good question.
like, as men, we go through emotional, psychological distress as well. It could be coming from the professional side, from a family side, marital relations, children, everything. So, but we don't necessarily put that this is me suffering because I'm a man. There isn't that kind of contextualization.
I think we really need to start talking about the tremendous social pressure that even men, undergo to perform masculinity. So when you talk about pain and suffering, uh, sadly, they're not universal because women and men experience the world differently. So gender, as feminism would tell you, is an organizing principle. It sort of colors your experiences in society. And the kind of pain and suffering that men go through and the kind of pain and suffering that maybe women go through may be different. But this is not to deny that gender violence is a watertight category specifically for women. Men go through a lot of gender violence in their own rights as well. They are under a tremendous, tremendous pressure to perform what is often referred to in feminist studies as hegemonic masculinity. So I have brilliant men friends who have, just like you, they've asked me, why is it so difficult for you? And I don't really see it being so hard. But fact of the matter is, there are certain experiences which seem very invisible to us. So let me give you a short example. This, of course, does not really speak about violence, but this speaks about discrimination of a very subtle level. So I remember, accompanied by my men friend, I was going with my car, and being in the service, we have a certain paraphernalia around us. There was a lot of theatrics. There was a very smart salute given by a police officer. However, that salute didn't come to me. It came to my man friend, who I was taking out, for a ride, for an inspection. And it's interesting how when I offered a tip to a person, he looked at my man friend and said, "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Never looking at me. So these are very subtle differences, which
I
should,
think
of course,
any Indian woman can relate to that kind of experience. Like,
absolutely. And,
it's so, it's so common in India.
yes, and there is a problem with that, Yajur. So what we're really saying is that you have to be cognizant. You have to notice that gender does exist. And sometimes it exists in very benign ways, but sometimes it exists in very insidious ways.
What you're talking about is the result of centuries or millennia of discrimination, right? Men have been in roles where they've held the economic and a social power. So that is so ingrained in our mind that even in Western countries, when people think of president, they just naturally use the pronoun he or him. Or like the experience you talked about, it was beautifully illustrated in a recent show on Netflix, Diplomat, where a female ambassador to the United Kingdom from United States, her
Right.
husband is addressed everywhere. So this is just a result. It's not going to go away immediately. It's going to take centuries for minds, people to see women in positions of power for that to change.
Yes.
But categorizing something like this as violence, isn't that going too far? I mean, this is just social conditioning, which is gradually giving away.
That's where the problem lies, because the social conditioning that we're exposed to would like you to believe that it is okay. It would like you to believe that this is harmless and that this is innocent. But anything that causes you chronic pain, chronic suffering, psychological ramifications, social ramifications, because it is not just a one-off story about me or my friend. This is something that is being felt at the societal level in different segments. So gender is not the all-pervasive category. Gender intersects with nationality. Gender intersects with ethnicity, class, caste, tribe. The women that I'm working here in Bengal with are Adivasi women who are working in tea gardens. Gender is a part of their identity. Along with their gendered identity is the history of displacement. Along with that identity is the history of the coolie trade. So gender has to intersect along with other identities to give you a better picture of the kind of violence that is taking place, which is why in Viram, we focus upon intersectionality. So when we say intersectionality, we say that gender cannot be, so there is no universal sisterhood as the women's liberation movement would want you to believe. The 1970s and 80s saw to the women's liberation movement in the West. And we were all very enthusiastic, possibly, people who I read about, they were particularly enthusiastic about the fact that, women have found a cause and all women have united together. But then you realize that the concept of a universal sisterhood just rings hollow when you don't really pay cognizance to class, caste, sexuality. Sexuality is a very important factor that has now become a part of contemporary feminism. So when you talk about a Black feminist school of thought, it's adding a bit of nuance to feminism. So feminism and contemporary feminism is not satiated with the idea of just a universal sisterhood. We want to talk about, the transsexual rights. We want to talk about environment and gender. We want to talk about Black feminism. We want to talk about post-colonial feminism, post-structuralist feminism. So what we're doing is we are actually now focusing our gaze on particular identities also. So there is a certain nuance to feminism, is what I'm trying to put across. It's not just a political goal where you are hating men, far from it. You're embracing them. You're actually exhorting them to be a part of the cause. And I love the men in my life, and they are some very strong feminists. So, it's a pity that the term feminism has been hijacked by people of different vested social interests and political ideologies. So it's important to really step back and reclaim feminism in terms of its substantive content rather than just its symbolism. For a long time, it was believed that just ensuring women's representation in certain spaces, in politics, or for that matter, policy making, the labor economics would create gender awareness and gender sensitivity. But that's not necessarily the case. The add and stir approach wouldn't really work in the case of feminism, because what you need to develop is a certain sensitivity and an empathy towards the kind of issues and problems that both men and women face differently. So that's yeah. Sure.
First of all, I think I have one observation when you said that there isn't really any universal sisterhood. I think that's one of the things that I've always been quite intrigued, that every time there is question of women's rights, the most vociferous critics of that tend to be women only. Even when we look historically on issues like widow remarriage and all, usually women were the biggest opposers to those kind of that kind of progress. So that for sure is true, and it's not uncommon to still see many young girls see that, oh, I'm not a feminist. It's almost like something that they have to put it out there, that I have nothing to do with feminists. I have nothing to do with those unhappy women, the caricature of feminists. But when you talk about non-physical forms of violence, and you give an example of a minor, well, maybe I shouldn't use the word minor, but a microaggression, and there are so many of these kind, like people telling women, oh, I'm not sure you can do this, I'm not sure. And it's all too common in India for people to say things like, oh, women are not very good drivers, or stuff like that, which continues. But we usually laugh it off as that no one really means it. These are things that we say, and we don't really think about the implications. And you pointed out that this creates a chronic pain, which might be unconscious, but it is impacting perhaps the confidence of those women, the sense of self-worth.
And their dignity, Ajur. Just to add a little bit more to that, it's not just about your psychological state of self-confidence. The notion goes further beyond. It's when your sense of dignity and personhood is being corroded. So let's say what you spoke about right now, a benign joke. how benign is it really to the person who's experiencing it? Because usually what we see is men and women are often unconscious carriers of such kind of sexism. You just say something off the cuff, and you'd obviously want a person not to be too sensitive about it, too touchy about it. You'd
Yes.
rather label the person as oversensitive and over emotional rather than doing a little bit of thinking on your own. So I think we need to become a little bit more mindful and reflexive about our everyday speech and conduct. So of course, you do create certain conceptual boundaries around subliminal violence. Not everything, not every act of aggression could really be treated under the umbrella term of subliminal violence. But you at least have to be willing to see that at the other end of the spectrum, the non-physical does not take away the intensity of the corrosive influence of violence. So, in Viram, what we've done is we have actually excavated experiences that have told us something. So we've had chapters such as Daira, we've had chapters such as Riti, where we were looking into cultural violence and what are the forms of cultural violence that women usually undergo. We've had chapters like Vada, where we were, exploring emotional deception and cheating. So we have looked at violence at the level of the discursive, the psychological, and the social. And when I say discursive, it is essentially talk like this that we are really wanting to make people aware of, that you maybe need to take that pause, think about it, about how does it impact another person. And I guess a bit of that thinking is important.
Do you get accused that perhaps you're going too woke? That's a very common criticism these days for this current generation, that maybe this generation is oversensitive. They're always looking for safe spaces and they are telling other people to be more considerate. But
Right.
perhaps this current generation needs to develop a thick skin. Why are they getting so easily offended by everyday things? Do you get accusation from perhaps
Oh,
it's being too woke?
you bet your life. We are developing a thick skin as the days go by, honestly. But being mindful and conscious about something doesn't really make you vulnerable. So accusations such as that are honestly welcome because they actually reflect a certain thinking, a certain paradigm, which we've been handed down very effortlessly. And thank God for a generation like ours, which is, in your terms, ultra sensitive, because had we really not been ultra sensitive about a few issues, they would have obviously and constantly been at the back burner. So I'm glad that we're sensitive about it. But of course, with the sensitivity, we have to also do some work around it. We can't just sit and moan and mop and say that, oh, bahut kharab lag gaya. We're feeling terrible about it. And we don't want to do anything about it. We just want to sit and, lament and lambast the society and its men. No, not in the least. We're here to actually create a feminist praxis. So what Viram is doing is we're trying to reach out to these people. We're trying to hear their stories of what is it that has, created such a ramification for them. And then we're trying to come together and really detect patterns of these violence that are often repetitive, that often, corrode your sense of selfhood and dignity, and that are social in nature because they are not, unique to a person. So yes, if that earns me that label, so be it.
But do you think this hurts women to some extent? So in the corporate domains, a lot of emphasis has been put on the kind of vocabulary and language which may be perceived as offensive to women. But what this is an observation by many people that this means that men have sort of retreated into all men groups in terms of socializing. So either this, to some extent, this has limited the socializing between men and women because now the men are more cautious around women. So it actually hurts women in terms of developing the kind of bonding that would have helped them in their career. Do you have a view on that?
So I do feel what you're saying is, these homonormative spaces that men are more guarded now with women is something that is a bit disconcerting, but you find that everywhere, honestly. Even where I am, I usually see in a party or, in a social occasion, men naturally gravitate towards men and women gravitate towards women. And maybe there is a kind of psychological security that is felt, but to what extent is it psychological and less sociological is what I'm here really to question, even in Viram, because a lot of these things are treated as psychological. For me, what is important is that we understand each other's thresholds, and it is very important to rather have these mixed gender conversations and to create more inclusive spaces where not only a woman, but even a man feels safe about what he's saying. So the more we interact and the more we engage and know about each other's feelings, would we really stand a chance of correcting them even in the future? Because homosocial and homophobic environments, homosocial environments breed a certain kind of, insularity. And any kind of insularity is not really welcome. So I just feel that there is
And
no
I think
need.
it hurts women more than men, because the
Absolutely.
reality is that the political domain, as well as the corporate domain, is dominated by men. Now,
Right.
if they insulate themselves and the women are sort of out of these circles, then they are left out from the mentorship as well as from the bondings. And we already see that on the political side, women have had equal rights where, to take political office for like 75 years. And how many women do we have now? It's a disgrace for our country.
We are going to get there. Let me assure you that we are really going to get there. And before we do, I think there's a little bit of learning that needs to happen from why just men and women, Yajur? Honestly, there are many genders. Gender is a very fluid concept. So my father is one of the most kind and nurturing men I've ever seen in my life. And by Jove, he's very masculine. So why just men and women, masculinity and femininity? There's a certain fluidity to the concept is what I'm trying to say. So definitely, I do agree that there are biological differences between us, very specific biological differences, but socialization just tends to exaggerate those differences. And I just feel those differences need to be less exaggerated. And you just need to know that at the end of the day, gender really shouldn't be what a category prescribes for you. Gender should recognize you for what you are, depending on the kind of masculinity and femininity that you want to display. So usually for a young officer like me, though I'm very happy to be in a social condition and in a political condition which offers me really the right to voice my concerns. So I am in a place, Yajur, I must tell you, where I don't always feel that I have to prove my sense of worth being a woman. Bengal offers me a kind of a platform to be able to work in an uninhibited manner. So I'm really grateful to that. But as I was saying, you need such inclusive spaces where you feel confident to work. And often what happens is, a dear friend of mine who's in the police service, she's posted in a different state. And she actually tells me about her experiences where she has to constantly prove that she's hyper masculine in order to be taken seriously. And this is a tragedy because I believe that the kind of feminine power that we have is something that is beautiful and that needs to be nurtured, and you need to be secure in that. I needn't really don another image just to consider or be treated seriously.
Yeah,
So I
yeah, of
think
course.
reveling uh, in your own femininity is very important, and in your own masculinity, that too is very important.
Yeah, no, that's actually really important, because you kind of you highlighted a difference between the biological and the gender, biological sex and the gender. And reality is that the feminine gender has been attributed to certain things. It's not attributed to positions of power,
Yeah.
whether in the defense forces or in political power.
Right.
And so for a long time, even when the door is open for the biologically sex of, when it comes to female as a biological sex to enter those domains, they tried to imitate the
Yes.
male gender
Yes.
so that they could be taken seriously. And it's not uncommon. I mean, we see stories, historical stories, that this princess, she was such a good swordsman and she used to wear male clothes, and everybody used to think of her as a prince, not as a princess. And it's something like as if like she was superior to the
Yeah.
princesses because she was a prince, because inherently in the mind there is that the male is superior to a woman, that as a gender.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that
And now
that hasn't.
just when you take the converse, Yajur, just take the converse. So we had this interesting segment in Viram called Khel. And we spoke about men who are not really interested in sports. It's a possibility that you
Yeah, of
have
course.
men who don't take to sports as naturally as, it's given to believe. But these men are usually tagged as effeminate. They are tagged to have failed masculinities, and that's where I see a problem.
And
Uh,
what's wrong with being effeminate? That's my question. Like,
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, this is what is wrong in being feminine and what is really wrong in being a feminist. It's
yes.
almost seen as if you're a supporter of terrorism, the way feminism as a term is being used. So I think it's very important that you really purge it of the other vested political interests that have got into the bandwagon of feminism. And you kind of really take a good relook at it. That's
That's what I was, but that's what I was saying. Like, even though now the law guarantees equality to men and women, we've achieved things that could be tangibly dealt with. So,
right.
laws and institutional sexism can be addressed because it's tangible. It's you can. But when it comes to cultural stuff, like the fact that people say it's a gentleman's agreement, or
Right.
oh, you are the man, like
Yeah,
this kind of thinking, it goes on. It's part of our language, our vocabulary. It's like
absolutely.
I might be saying these things that I don't even literally mean, but that's just how
It's
generations
exactly
have grown into it.
the language can be very limiting, is
Yeah.
what we're talking about in Viram. We don't have the right social vocabulary. It's only this ultra sensitive generation of ours that has come up with terms like narcissism, gaslighting, things that we didn't even know about. Just a few years ago, maybe a decade or two ago, nobody would really talk about curb stalking. Nobody would talk about gaslighting. Nobody would talk about narcissism. Nobody would talk about codependence. And I just feel that our vocabulary is getting enriched by the day as we're exploring these new terrains of power, which is why I think before we approach feminism, what's important is to understand what gender is vis-a-vis power. So power is a very important tool and a concept to understand before you really go to feminism as such. And I'm just glad, Yajur, that we are now trying to sort of really interrogate the kind of language that we're using. So you spoke about laws. Now, I must tell you that, laws have taken a lot of social movements, a lot of sweat and blood, literally, to crystallize into these progressive social laws that you see before you. You see certain sections of the IPC, CRPC, you see the Act Against Domestic Violence. All of these acts are a result of certain waves of feminist movements that have actually influenced the making of these laws, because initially culture was misappropriated in various ways for gender-based brutal forms of violence to take place. So laws need to develop with greater social consciousness. So feminism is all about pushing the envelope a little bit more and not being content with where you are. So let's say feminists are never satisfied with what they have achieved. They are actually very ambitious people. Being a feminist is about being a very ambitious, espousing equality in very ambitious terms. And just to, add a little bit to that, sometimes law can also be very regressive. Laws can be regressive laws, and the procedural law especially the fact that I am a part of the bureaucracy, I can tell you this. It is not only the law, but the procedure that leads to the law can be very, what do I say? It can be very asymmetric in power. So the study that I did on Khap Panchayats, so there is a law, okay, and you can take punitive action against people who engage in this practice. You can take punitive action against these extra-constitutional bodies, but we
You
don't.
mean like honor killings given by Khap Panchayats and all?
Absolutely. So we do have laws which can take, punitive action against such acts, which are essentially murders. But it usually doesn't happen. Why doesn't it happen? Because there's a lot of social taboo. There's a lot of, social networking that protects these acts from happening. So while there may be laws, the lawmakers and people who are custodians of justice may circumvent laws because they ascribe to certain kinds of patriarchal ideologies, which would not let law to happen. So law often even cannot take its course until and unless people who are handling law are trained, are actually sensitized in the true sense of the word. So while there may be a law, the social scenario remains very different. So it is, in fact, I'm writing an article currently on human rights and subliminal violence. And I just feel that human rights practitioners need to be a little bit more cognizant about such forms of violence because they're difficult to express. So let me give you an example related to, honor killings. Of course, honor killing is the last brutal act of, gender violence. But before honor killing, a woman undergoes various taboos and a lot of social humiliation is what she experiences. She's actually socially boycotted by her kinsmen, by her family, and is often in the state of a destitute woman. So these little violences are never really spoken about by law because they're considered to be too trivial. And they don't usually have any empirical evidence. But of course, the murder, which is treated to be the last and the most brutal act of quantifiable violence, because it's right there in front of your eyes, that is treated as violence. But the social death of the woman takes place way before the act of the murder. So subliminal violence in that sense alerts you to the possibility that there can be more cruel and more disturbing manifestations of violence. So you take cognizance of it at the very initial stage of its inception, rather than letting it really go out of control.
Yeah, this was going to be like one of the things that I was thinking about, like, don't you get like the sense that like, oh, are you, not the sense like, don't people question you that are you a little bit detached from the Indian society where you just pick up any paper and it's full of news about acid attacks on women, to murders and chopping off their body into pieces, and as well as gang rapes, honor killings, as you just mentioned, and so much more worse things. Like in a society like that, where this kind of stuff is happening with unimaginable frequency, how do you even get to a point where you talk about microaggressions? Like why does that even take priority in a society where such clear and extreme forms of violence are taking place on almost everyday basis?
It's a good question, really. So far from being detached from the Indian society, I'd rather say I'm firmly embedded to the Indian society. Being an officer of the Indian Administrative Service, I've had the opportunity to see India for what it is. But then at the same time, I do believe there are many Indias which are existing, cheek by jowl. So there is no one Indian society. And when you really talk about the kind of brutal forms of violences that you've spoken about honor killings, you've spoken about the rape, you've spoken about acid attacks, you must realize that these acts have emanated from a certain kind of disposition towards the victim. And this disposition is one of anger, resentment at a particular gender. You know, it's not really an accident as to why many of the survivors, I'd rather call them survivors and not victims, why many of the survivors of the acid attack or rape have been women. You know, it's not a freak of an accident that, you know, a lot of these survivors are women. So it does tell you about the fact that the cultural and the social conditioning towards the gender has to be dealt with at a very early age. Because discrimination, stereotypes, and, you know, a sort of a wrong cultural ideology towards a particular gender can manifest into brutal ways. So let's just say, when you're saying that, you know, there's already too much on our plate, there's so much of violence that is taking place, why are we really focusing on this? Because we're talking about the inception of such brutal forms of violence. They don't really occur in a vacuum. You just don't throw acid on a person because you felt like doing it. You know, the person who is at the receiving end is actually initially facing, is the victim of a masculine entitlement that has made this violence possible. So very little things, Yajur, very little insignificant biases, prejudices, stereotypes, and cultural ideologies manifest into something so heinous.
Is it something like, in the example that you talked about, is it something like that, how dare a woman reject me? It's an affront to my masculinity.
Absolutely. That's a sense of entitlement. That's a sense of entitlement that speaks of very fragile egos. So one problem, I'll tell you, with you know, our sense of hegemonic masculinity is we have created masculinity to be a hard, small cage where men have to be, you know, inside those little boxes and those little cages. The harder you are, the more of a mard you are. But ironically, the harder you pretend to be, the more fragile your egos are. And this I attribute to a form of parenting and a socialization, which just, you know, doesn't allow men to really be secure about their vulnerabilities. So I do feel that a lot of this comes from, you know, a space where men are not allowed to feel what they're feeling. You know, I have beautiful nephews and nieces of mine, and it's sad also to see that my own family often is bringing them up in a way which I wouldn't really do to my child. I would rather make my child feel very happy in their own space and in their own energies. So I think the more harder we sell masculinity, and especially this toxic form of masculinity, the more vulnerable, the more fragile would men's egos be. So whatever acts that you've just mentioned right now is stemming from a bias. कि उसकी जुर्रत कैसे हुई, उसने मुझे ना कर दिया. How could she refuse me? How could she not, you know, attend to my needs at this moment?
And he's been culturally taught that that is emasculation. So you have,
Absolutely.
which causes that much rage.
Perhaps, you know, Yajur, there's one word, if I completely run away from, it's feminism is something I embrace. It's emasculation. Emasculation doesn't make sense to me. It rings really hollow. Why at all should a man feel emasculated at not having his needs immediately being taken care of? And that's really where I would really like to pull out the plug and say Viram. So Viram is all about, you know, no more. No more would you be fed with these thoughts that perpetuate this gender asymmetry. I mean, how many acid attack victims are really men? So, you know,
I mean, not to my knowledge.
yes. So I've had Lakshmi on Viram. You know, Lakshmi is a powerful, beautiful acid attack survivor. And there's even a movie, you know, made after her. And she kind of walked me through her entire history of being a victim of the acid attack, which which was preceded by, in fact, many little innocuous acts of, what we refer to as love in common parlance. Arey, wo to mujhe bahut pyar karta hai. He's just very over possessive about me. He's just very controlling. All of these terms, which seem so innocent and so good, and they're even sold by popular media, that, the boy chases you and you then, go to the boy. And this guy who did this to her was chasing her for a long time. And he subscribed to the story that was being sold to him, that he needs to chase the woman in order to woo her, rather than really earning her respect. So it's the kind of stories that are also circulated that
Yeah.
create, this tremendous pressure felt by both the genders.
I mean, we've had the whole cultural thing from movies and everything. If she says no, that means she means yes. Like that kind of cultural conditioning is pretty deep rooted.
Yes, absolutely.
And people normally talk about things like ordinarily people will say things like, oh, he's a very good husband, he's given so much freedom to his wife, as if it's something for him to give.
Absolutely.
And nobody questions. But your point is that it is addressing these prejudices and all at that stage is what can prevent us reaching a stage when
Yes, so you
wives are
start early.
killed and acids
Yes,
are thrown and
yes,
rapes are done.
absolutely. You start early. You start talking about it early, and you are a tad bit touchy about it. That's best to prevent, things. So when we teach girls to shrink themselves, when we tell them that you can have ambition, but not too much, when we tell them that you can be successful, but not too successful, is something that I have a problem with. Close your legs, cover yourself, make sure you talk less, don't laugh too hard. So being born female, usually as a part of our conditioning, we're already guilty of something. And these young girls, when they grow up to be women, you do not see them as women capable of desire, as capable of other proclivities also. And this is something that we even addressed in Viram. We had an entire chapter on desire, the feminine desire, kama. And it is such a banned thing, to really talk about. It's such a taboo that we wanted to talk about really how desire is sort of suppressed by the cultural discourse. And just like desire, there are other forms of these little acts of suppression that also take place.
No, I was just thinking that whenever something like the Nirbhaya case happens, after that, the entire national discourse, well, first of all, not every such case gets that kind of attention. It's only on those rare occasions that our society shakes itself out of that apathy. But when it does, the discourses tends to be about how to come up with death punishments, capital punishment, and more severe punishments for the perpetrators,
Right.
or like better policing, etc., etc. But there is no question, no, there is almost like no discussion around what drove somebody to do that, what festers such misogyny in our society, and how to deal with that. And I think it's very interesting that you are sort of like working on one approach to address that, like to sort of nip it in the bud kind of thing, right? Like, let's address where that problem is coming from. Otherwise you're just chasing afterwards, let's do a candle march and let's give death punishment to these people, but that's not solving any problem.
With due respect to the legal discourse, that of course is a space that we are not in this conversation getting into. So with due respect to legal procedure, I just feel that, these conversations need to start early. And it's difficult to have these conversations, Yajur, in the aftermath of a brutal incident, as the incident that you've mentioned. It's difficult because right there and then, it's about the severity, it's about the intensity with which something so horrific has happened. So cultural discourse, conditioning, all of that momentarily takes a back seat. But I guess what I feel is that it does need to be revisited at, of course, an appropriate time, when the immediacy of the furor has kind of, abated and has also been taken care of by the due legal proceedings. So those kind of conversations do need to happen, definitely. But
But
I
any, yeah,
appreciate, but I would even appreciate if those conversations do not always happen in a conflict-ridden space. So this is my problem also with the human rights discourse. We are always willing to talk about gender violence when there is a conflict-like situation that happens. In a state of normalcy, nobody really would be talking about power. Nobody really would be talking about violence. It's only when something as serious as this has happened do we really take to a conversation about gender. So gender needs to become an everyday conversation, is what we're talking about. It needs to be spoken in unglamorous, mundane spaces. It needs to be spoken in our homes with our most trusted and cherished people, with our partners, our parents, with our friends. So unless and until you really make it a part of our everyday curriculum.
honestly, I can just tell you from my experience, even mention of this usually gets very negative reactions. Like, just to mention that India ranks amongst the last countries in the world on gender gap as per the World Economic Forum immediately gets people's reaction that, oh, that all international organizations are biased against India. Look at,
Right,
legally Indian women have the same rights as men, blah 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 blah
right,
blah.
right.
How can we be worse than Afghanistan, or how can we be worse than Pakistan, or whatever? Like, that's the kind of reactions that are all, I think everybody right now in India would be familiar with this kind of reaction, that let's not defame India by
Right.
talking about these things. So I've seen that in normal times, almost there is no receptible,
Receptivity
yeah,
towards
there's no
gender.
receptivity to this, to addressing that we really have a problem.
Absolutely.
It becomes a question of like, oh, we can't actually be worse than Afghanistan, or we can't be worse than Pakistan or Saudi Arabia. And then the whole entire discourse is like, is Saudi Arabia worse or is India worse?
Right. So, okay. So to those who are essentially providing a critique to these reports that you talk about of the World Economic Forum, or for that matter, World Bank, I mean, kudos to them, because I do believe that a lot of the reporting that happens is designed from a very Eurocentric perspective also. So it's good in a way that people are critiquing about these indicators of India not really faring too well. So that I do understand. But then again, a lot of what the World Economic Forum, or for that matter, the International Labour Organization or the World Bank in its reports gathers are statistical facts. And what we're essentially trying to say is that along with the statistical rigor of looking at women's participation in politics, in the labor market, their health or education indices, also look at, their stories. It's very important to realize, Yajur, that women are not just statistical facts and data. There is a story behind every such violence that is occurring. So definitely there is an NCRB report. There are these reports that measure crime, that map crime. But what I feel is that we also need different tools of measurement to actually gauge the kind of violence that is happening at the familial and the societal level. And that is often something that is not reported in these fancy reports, which, pardon me, are a lot, led by a group of these neoclassical economists who take great pride in being able to measure and quantify everything. I just feel it is also important to have anthropologists on board. I feel it is important to have sociologists on board. I feel it is important also to have psychologists on board when it comes to really measuring and mapping gender violence. And why I say anthropology is because anthropology gives you the lens to see that what is happening in the West is in fact no better. Even the West has a certain, has not really adjusted to its own rhetoric and nara of gender equality. So I do agree that the Western women's movement, the liberation movement, emerged in the West, but whether they have really sorted their issues is again a different debate, because the kind of stigma and discrimination that one even encounters in the West, it's something that is honestly, it needs to be experienced and felt. So I would not really place India on any such Eurocentric indicator that tells us that we are not faring as good as, let's say, a Nordic country. So such comparisons require a different rigor, a qualitative rigor. And this is what, when I talk about anthropology is important because it tells you that violence exists everywhere in different manifestations. And,
I would,
yes,
you're the
yes,
expert in this, so I take your view, but I would just make one observation. The one
please.
difference is we suppress the discussion about this. That's one difference between the West and us. Whether we are better or not, there is no attempt to suppress the discussion there, which we
Right,
have here.
right,
So
right.
I would just put that. And yes, I think there are problems everywhere, but it's important to have the conversations about these problems and not dismiss them, which is
Absolutely.
I think what you're doing. But I wanted to also ask, are we are we ready to talk, like when you talk about like, oh, okay, a lot of this discourse, feminist discourse, does come from the West, there's no doubt about it, but the language that even the Indian feminists use, a lot of the vocabulary is very
Right,
Western, and which is what I
right.
wanted to ask you, that when you try to like connect with uh, ordinary people in India, are you able to translate this vocabulary? Like, does it even mean anything when you speak in Hindi or Bhojpuri or Bangla? Like these kind of, I mean, I don't even know if there are phrases for these kind of things.
Absolutely, there are. In fact, Yajur, our folklores, our folk songs, our oral traditions, they are replete with a lot of humor, banter about the kind of, trials and tribulations that women go through. So I must tell you, I've spoken to women who speak in Sadri. So Sadri is an interesting sort of a hybrid language,
Yes.
which lies at the confluence of a bit of Hindi, Bhojpuri, and Kuruk. So, Sadri as a language, when I would talk to these women, the kind of terms that they have to actually express such forms of violence, it's amazing how limited English as a language can be, and how much more rich, colorful, and textured regional languages can be. And they can offer you, in fact, a different prism. So one important aspect that these women taught me about is how violence need not always be active. It can even be passive. So they were
Hmm.
talking to me about their marad log, where they said, Laparwahi bhi to hinsa hoti hai. So laparwahi was about negligence, what we talk about in English.
Yes, of course.
And they were talking about how they have been completely abandoned by their husbands. They're not taking care of their children. The husbands are hardly attentive to their emotional needs. And it was a different world that they offered me. And I actually thought, we're so smug with our Western expensive education, and we think that we're here to teach the world and give the world a new vocabulary of feminist liberation. But these women, in their very humble ways, have taught me the tension of vocabulary. So, along with describing their everyday experiences of violence in very graphic and layered terms, they have also, made me aware of their coping mechanisms. These women often take to humor to cope against such forms of chronic violence. And that's when I sort of connected the dots and looked to a particular scholar who I used to read, by the name of Jean Scott. So Scott used to talk about weapons of the weak. So this particular lady, she told me that when her husband wants to get really close to her and cozy up to her, she gives a bahana of a sir dard or something, and she evades it. She evades complying to his diktats in very interesting ways by being a part of the system without really upturning the system, but at the same time challenging the husband. She'll say something, she roti jala degi ya kuch ek kar legi, which doesn't sit very well with the husband and turns his mood off. So, Yajur, there's a lot out there in terms of stories that are waiting to be discovered by people. Why only the Sadri women? I've interacted with the Santhals, and the Santhals have their own stories of hunger and malnutrition, the article that you spoke about, a very important form of subliminal violence that I saw in some of these Santhal households is that women are often themselves. They deny themselves food. They stay hungry because it is considered to be an act of feminine propriety that you don't really express your hunger to your in-laws or your husband. So you stay like that. Okay.
Gosh.
And a lot of that is even happening in our so-called elite families. Of course, not maybe of this particular nature, but different things as well. Have you even wondered, Yajur? In fact, I can see subliminal violence even in architectural design. So I had a very interesting conversation with architects of the Delhi School of Architect, and this was Mr. Kabir Vajpayee, and he told me that, Priyadarshani, have you ever wondered, why are these toilets, women's, ladies' toilets, always at the end of a tube? It's often tucked in a dark corner, and it is hardly being used by anyone. And what does this cause? I said, no, sir, I have no idea. He said, this, don't you see the subliminal violence here? It is leading to a lot of UTI cases, urinary tract infection cases. Women are not using the washrooms. It's because of the very architectural design of a space that prevents women from accessing certain facilities that are made for them. He spoke about his experiences in Rajasthan.
And they're done like that so that the women can have like a private area? Like, why are they built like that?
Exactly.
Okay.
So that is out of a concern of privacy. But
Right.
I just feel that, you need policy makers, architects, lawmakers to have a larger stakeholdership when it comes to their subject. Before creating something, it's very important to interact with the beneficiaries that you're creating it for.
And they're not involved, right? That's the main point.
Exactly. And they're
The
not
women are
involved.
not the architects. They're not part of the
Absolutely.
committees which are making these determinations.
Yes.
And it hasn't changed. Even if you look at the current setup that we have in India, most of the bodies, the governing bodies, where
Right.
is the women representation?
Absolutely. And where is even the gender consciousness? So even if men have the kind of tools of gender sensitivity, I feel we can do much better than where we are. And this just, takes me to another interesting conversation that a celebrity had on my very platform. And he espoused being a very liberal person because he was gender blind and he was gender agnostic. And he, in fact, it was in a very self-congratulatory tone. And he was like, I'm a true feminist because I'm gender blind. That is not what feminism is really about. You have to wear those lenses,
Yeah, I think this is something that comes up again and again. Oh, I'm caste blind, I'm gender blind, I'm race blind. We see
Yeah.
these kind of, but that is basically that I'm going to deny
Right.
all the privileges or all the biases of centuries or millennia. And I'm going to completely disregard all the structural challenges you have as a woman versus what I have. And I'm going to say, oh, we are both the same and you are just underperforming. I had this conversation with somebody that isn't it the same last names that tend to dominate when I was at IIT, the same last names of my professors, students. Then when I went into doing a job, it was again the same last names across like maybe there's 20, 30, 40 last names that I keep seeing everywhere in a
Right.
country of 1.4 billion. And I said, like, isn't it strange that we see the same last names dominate everything? And he's like, yeah, because we work really hard and we prioritize education, and clearly we are getting all the jobs and we have all the seats and everything. And that makes me think that this person is clearly caste blind. He's completely oblivious to his privilege. And the same thing with between men and women. Like somebody the other day was saying, oh, but look, all the chefs in the world are men, so men must be better cooks. Like people are that is when you are blind to entire history.
Yes. And that's sad because you're ahistorical in a way.
Yeah.
You're giving any credence to history. And I really don't know people who are ahistorical in terms of their orientation. What better decisions are they really capable of? So yes, I completely agree.
I want to actually address this thing later. But before that, I also wanted to ask something specific, which I noted down.
Yeah.
Motherhood is also something that you look at with a critical lens. Now, motherhood is obviously something the most pure and natural concept. Like it's considered almost reverential,
Yes.
not just in India but globally. So tell us more about that. Like, how do you think about, how do you bring that into this discourse?
So it's interesting that you asked me, because we had a chapter on Vatsalya in Viram, and motherhood essentially for all of us feminists of Viram means nurturance and can't simply be ascribed to a particular gender. And sometimes, Yajar, it's very important to have uncomfortable conversations also. And feminism is all about having these uncomfortable conversations, because motherhood is a very culturally cherished idea, which has now become almost an ideology. And when a construct is made into an ideology, that is where the problem lies. So if motherhood is constricting in the sense that only women are capable of nurturance, I think I do have a problem with that, because my experience and the experience of many people who I have been with and interacted has, in fact, just belied, this construct of motherhood meaning a self-sacrificing woman or a female body, which is willing to undergo trials and tribulations, and completely, in a way, deny herself her needs. So in Viram, we spoke about the kind of violence that this ideology of motherhood imposes on you. And by the ideology of motherhood, I mean the participants who can be not only your family, but for that matter, even society, your workplace. So essentially, the idea was in Vatsalya to speak to as many women and men as possible in order to know whether, motherhood is something all that natural, biological, spontaneous, or is it also the burden of social and cultural expectations that you really carry with you? Hence, Vatsalya, because motherhood also entails, conversations about postpartum depression. It entails conversations about, having to balance your work and family life. And why is motherhood considered to be, like a fresh beginning that can erase the identities that you carried with yourself and the ambitions that you nurtured? So we were having these conversations with mothers, and we had, with us some, very powerful, very beautiful women. We had Divya ji from Kerala Kada. She's the district collector of Pathanamthitta. We had Shraddha Pandey, an IPS officer, who was with us. And she shared with us really, the trials that they have undergone, but at the same time, the way they have reappropriated motherhood. They have allowed a new definition or a redefinition of motherhood to suit their context. So we were against the universalizing construct, because I have a doting father, and he's been a mother to me for many years, and I don't see the divide as such. I just feel it is a shared responsibility that needs to be taken, and the fact that nurturance cannot really be ascribed to any particular gender. I've had friends who have been adopted. They have found the requisite love, support from their, parents, who of course adopted them, but at the same time, their love was no less. So it was essentially a critical lens to a topic which is very cherished, because the family, you must understand, is a cherished space. Nobody would want, feminists to intrude into this space. But as the feminists in the 1970s really gave their rallying cry, the personal is political. So the family is political. The body is political. Desire is political. And anything that falls within the purview of coercion and control is political. So hence retrieving motherhood really from the clutches of a universal dogma.
It's related to what you earlier talked about, gender and biological, right? Like, so gender is obviously a social construct of social conditioning and cultural conditioning. So
Right.
is the motherly love the way we think about the mother culturally, that she's willing to sacrifice herself for her child, that infinite love, is that coming from the gender side? Is it like how she has been conditioned, a woman, or is something biological in a female human, that she immediately becomes like that towards her child? And I don't know, I would just like to, have you considered, like, when it just talking about biology, to the extent that humans are part of the mammal community, it's
Absolutely.
actually an anomaly that in case of humans, the father is as involved as they tend to be, whereas across the entire kingdom of mammals, fathers have almost no involvement. Like, it's always like the fathers, well, they participate in conception of the child, but after that, it's only the mothers who are rearing the child, whether it's, you look at elephants or monkeys or literally the whole mammal kingdom. It's something, it's almost like an anomaly at some point, whatever happened in the human history, that the fathers started remaining so involved in the rearing of the child.
Do you really
And
think that's an anomaly? Do you?
no, I'm just saying from a purely biological
I
standpoint.
find this funny because a lot of people often turn to evolutionary biology to counter feminists. So apes, female apes bow down to male apes. But at the end of the day, we're not apes. Apes
Hmm,
eat earthworms. We don't eat earthworms. So I'll only ascribe this much to evolutionary biology, but definitely not beyond a point.
hmm,
It's interesting how we often take recourse, even Yajur, to evolutionary biology to counter something that is so historically conditioned.
hmm,
So maybe looking towards history, maybe looking towards cultural psychology would be a better idea than turning to evolutionary biology to support this. But of course, one thing that you mentioned, the family, as the prized social unit, really came into the fore due to certain agrarian,
yeah.
sedentary economic imperatives. So the family, the settled family, was not always, a natural, spontaneous sort of a growth that happened. It was something that was designed to cater to
When we
the
move from
economic
the hunter
motivation.
gatherer to the agrarian man, yes.
Exactly, exactly. And in fact, the famous theorist Parsons from LSE, he writes about how the nuclear family really developed as, an offshoot of the Industrial Revolution, where the idea of a nuclear family of just the father, looking after the economic needs of the household, the mother contributing to the reproduction and the social reproduction of the household, play a very important functional role for the sustenance of society. And it's interesting how, industrial economics tended to reinforce the cultural stereotype of the woman as the nurturer and the man as the breadwinner. So a lot of cultural ideologies have been handed to us out of an interface of economics and politics, I feel. They have just not developed organically, but they have also been superimposed by certain hegemonic narratives. So the Industrial Revolution played a very major role in popularizing the notion of not only the nuclear family, but also of conjugality. So the romantic relationship was never really uh, a concept. Romantic love soon became a sort of a new terrain for commerce, for the kind of new kind of commodity fetishism that happened. So romance now came to be packaged, it came to be shown. So certain things that are handed down out of certain political imperatives, and it's important that we recognize that. Similarly, this idea of a woman being tethered to her home so that she can take care of the sustenance. the reproduction of the family, is something that I find problematic. You know, a lot of us are now challenging this by the kind of lives that we lead, not because we want to be combative, but because we feel that we need to do justice to what we feel comfortable with, rather than having to prove a point to society.
And a lot of these cultural norms have become anachronistic in the contemporary social and political realities of today, right? We just continue them because they are tradition, and there are plenty of people out there trying to guard tradition because you don't need to guard them if they make sense in the current times. The reason you have to guard them is because they have become anachronisms, but you still want them to continue. So then you become the defenders of tradition. But like the example that you mentioned earlier about the bathroom and that being a form of violence, it makes sense. But then that makes me question, what method do you use to come up with anything that's unfair to be deemed, whether it's a form of violence or not? Like,
absolutely.
How do you, like, is there like some kind of measures?
There is a method to the madness, I must tell you. And the method is the rigor of feminist epistemology. So here we take inspiration from scholars who have written a lot about epistemology. It is about the embodied experience. It's very important, Yajur, as the kind of feminists that we are. It's important to really listen to the kind of conversations that women and men are both having about violence. So it's important to be a little discerning about the kind of words, phrases, naming and identification that they carry forward. So violence is only something that is referred to as violence with a certain frequent and a regular pattern by the people who we engage with in Viram. So that is the kind of content that we are churning out based on their embodied experiences. Now, those you may counter, but of course, it's one thing to counter it intellectually, and it's another to counter it from the level of feelings. So we give credence, we validate the feelings that people pour out to us. We kind of present it to the viewer, and we tell you to decide for yourself whether there is something wrong with this particular person's narrative. So we just nudge you. We don't want to make you think of this being something as violence by packaging it in certain ways. We give you a sort of an undistilled version of what the person is trying to say in their rendition of injustice or in their rendition of pain. And what we do is we try to see if there is a pattern. So the tools that we apply are qualitative in nature, which entails the tool of feminist interviewing. So whenever somebody comes, talks to us, the information is confidential. We respect their privacy. All the content is anonymous. But at the same time, we listen very keenly on whether this is a psychological aberration, an anomaly, or it is a social fact that is being experienced by many of a certain cohort and a certain social profile. And that's how we then structure the experiences to form a certain theme and a content. So it's essentially the methodology of everyday ethnography also. We're talking, we're engaging, we're trying to see if this is really causing hurt, harm, and there is a certain chronic nature to this hurt experienced by a sizable number of people. And it's then when we really showcase the content, and whether or not it is violence is up to the viewer to really decide.
And okay, and that's how you're studying. But I have to say that what you are doing, or what you have undertaken to do, is extremely challenging. Because when we think about the previous waves of feminists, they were fighting for legal and political equality, which are clearly defined and measurable. So if you're fighting for the right to vote and you win you get the right to vote, so it's a clear outcome.
It's tangible, exactly.
Yeah, but social equality is very murky and it's very complicated. So in that sense, like what you are working towards, or just generally the current the feminists of today, you're trying to fight these unconscious biases, the cultural norms which have been there for centuries, and and just like you pointed out, like there were political expediencies that resulted in these kind of cultural norms in those times that made people take on certain roles or attribute certain roles to certain genders. Now you are trying to shed a light on why this thing is the way it is. It's not universal. Woman is not necessarily required to be taking on that role or not. But this is really tough. Like, it's very, very tough. You are because you're fighting something that's going on in somebody's head. Like, you can it's okay to deal with an institution. You can say that this institution has to allow women just as it allows the men. But the next step, what you're trying to do is, the men shouldn't think the way they are thinking in their heads. And how do you, or the women shouldn't even think the way they are thinking, that they're not inferior or anything. But this is something that I don't know how you even.
It's a difficult project,
Measure.
definitely.
It's a very difficult project. Yeah, it's very challenging. I mean, I think it's great and you should work towards it. But I just think that it's not like, and that is probably why a lot of people, they have started dismissing feminism, because they don't see the tangible outcomes that these women, that today's feminists are working towards.
Right, right. It's interesting. Okay, you've mentioned two things that I think I'd like to clarify at the very instant. First is these things are not really happening in our heads, so we don't really want to do a psychological sort of an analysis and talk about people's unconscious desires and motivations. Whatever that is going on at the realm of biases is very much manifesting in terms of practices. So our realm and our unit of study is the social behavior. It is not really the psychological disposition. It's the disposition that leads you to behave in a certain way. So our unit of analysis and intervention is very much tangible. And so it's essentially social behavior. And number two, those who do not identify with the cause due to a certain utilitarian logic of not achieving the results, it's sad. That's all that I can say. If we're so hell-bent on achieving immediate results, then I guess we don't have such pseudo-feminists along with us, because goals are not attained overnight. And when it comes to social conditioning, these are very resilient by nature, but their resilience does not deny the impossibility of tinkering and nudging us towards certain healthy, gender inclusive and gender sensitive forms of behavior. It's important that we realize that it is something that is very much attainable, but it would require a certain understanding of the language and the thinking in which people operate. So if you want to really create that change, that social change, it is very important that you understand the context where the people come from. So for example, if I want to make a certain change in the tea gardens of Jalpaiguri, I have to understand their history, their context, the kind of violence that they are undergoing, the notion of failed masculinity in the wake of global capitalism. I have to understand these issues. So it is not really a futile exercise. Definitely, it may be a bit of an unglamorous exercise, because we're not necessarily concerned with just the hysteria around brutal violence. We're also interested in the mundane, the normative spaces, and through the practice of social sensitization and the right nudge, I believe we'll be able to create a more inclusive language, a more alternative discourse, which recognizes how insidious power can be. So I'm very hopeful about this
Let me
project.
clarify. Certainly far from futile. I think it's extremely admirable. What I was trying to point was at the enormity of the challenge, because because it's not, you're absolutely right. Like, it's not like just something that's going on in somebody's head. It's getting manifested in the actions, as we've talked about through this discussion. But to tackle his actions or her actions, you have to address the
No,
unconscious
the
biases
intangible.
in the mind. So you're fighting against social conditioning of what it means to be a man, or masculinity, what it means, which has been around for centuries. It's the out. You're fighting against centuries worth of cultural conditioning,
Yes,
which I'm
absolutely.
thinking is an enormous challenge. But I mean, all the more I admire you, all the more for that, for taking on that enormous task. And thank you so much for sharing with us, like in such simple words, like what it actually means, and for illuminating for our viewers what
Thank you.
the current feminists are tackling. I think it's quite important. And I think it's the most interesting thing for me personally was the fact that what you pointed out, that it is these microaggressions
Right.
that when they're left unaddressed, they lead to what horrifies us when it manifests itself in rapes or murders by these panchayats and or families. It needs to be stopped at the level when there is a microaggression by a brother or a father or a husband or a neighbor. And that is why it's so important to deal with these. It's not just being woke, it's actually being realizing where the real cause is.
I would just say, Yaju, a feminist is a man or a woman who says that, yes, there is a problem and we need to fix it. That is what feminism essentially represents to me in the simplest of terms, that we must do better. And I welcome everybody, honestly, within its fold. Feminism is not just for the scholars or for the gender practitioners or for the sociologists. It's for anybody who wants to experience, the injustice that operates at different levels. It's about a person who is filled with not only compassion, but the courage to really speak up for injustice. That's as simply put, feminism for me. That's how I appropriate the term.
Thank you so much, Priyadarshani. And I would encourage anyone who's viewing this video to share your view with us on what does feminism mean to you, and does India need more feminism or less? Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Nagmati.
Pleasure.
Namaste.